Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katherine and I am the director of Tulane Law School's Criminal Justice Clinic. I am also the co-director of our Women's Prison Project. And for the last probably 30 years of my career, I've worked representing criminal defendants in our legal system and worked on trying to make some reforms in the criminal legal system here in Louisiana. And so it is an incredible honor for me and also really exciting for me to be here with our panelists who have come at the area of criminal reform through some really interesting stories. And since what we're all about is stories, and that's how we move people and make change, I'm so excited to introduce to you our panelists here today. So first I'd like to sort of start with the co-authors, and I'm going to do a little plugging here of Fighting Time. And we have Dr. Amy Banks and Mr. Isaac Knapper, who are the co-authors of Fighting Time. Mr. Knapper, who is now a coach, and I want to make sure I get this right, and trainer with the Crescent City Boxing Gym here in New Orleans. He's a lifelong boxer, and he's working and coaching young people to help keep them off the streets and out of trouble. He's been a boxer his entire life, and actually, this one, he apparently missed making the U.S. boxing team by one bout. Mm-hmm. It has to have been one of the more challenging experiences. But when he was 15 years old, he was the Louisiana's Golden Glove champion. All right. But his story, when he turned 16, his story in his boxing career got derailed when Mr. Knapper was arrested and wrongfully convicted for the murder of a Dr. Ronald Banks here in New Orleans. In 1992, after 13 years at Angola State Penitentiary, Angola was then known as the bloodiest prison in America, Mr. Knapper was exonerated, and it was learned that the state, the prosecutor, had withheld exculpatory evidence. Dr. Amy Banks, Mr. Knapper's co-author, is the daughter of Dr. Ronald Banks, the man Mr. Knapper was wrongfully convicted of killing. Dr. Banks is a psychiatrist whose specialty is actually in the neurobiology of trauma, and I'll talk about the connection there. Before she joined Mr. Knapper in writing the book about their father's murder and Mr. Knapper's wrongful conviction, she was the author of two other books in her professional field, The Complete Guide to Mental Health for Women, a little different subject perhaps, and 4 Ways to Click, Rewiring Your Brain for Stronger, More Rewarding Relationships. So also should be on your to-read list, I think. But a few years ago, and I'll let them tell the story, Dr. Banks reached out to Mr. Knapper, and they came together and wrote the book, Fighting Time. So in addition to Dr. Banks and Mr. Knapper, we also have Sister Helen Prejean. Sister Prejean is the author of 3 books, and I'm going to do the little show.
Do your little thing.
Yep. Dead Man Walking, The Death of Innocence, and A River of Fire is her most recent book. I think many of us are going to know Sister Prejean for Dead Man Walking, in which Susan Sarandon sort of portrayed her life. So many of us may
a look-alike, you know.
And Sister Helen was born in Louisiana. She joined the Sisters of St. Joseph in 1957 and taught high school. I didn't know that about you. Is that right?
You had a lot of things there.
Yeah.
You know, you can keep it short.
She then moved into the St. Thomas housing projects to live and work with the people in that community, and I think that was portrayed in the movie.
Very important.
But she spent a lot of time getting to know people who were serving sentences up at Angola State Penitentiary, particularly those on death row who were sentenced to die. And it is those relationships that she's developed that then became the subject matters of her 2 books. And since then, she has been one of the most renowned and well-known advocates fighting, campaigning against the death penalty, both nationally and internationally. And so I want to welcome all three of you and say thank you, and it is really, truly an honor to be here with you. We have so little time, and I think there's so much to say. So what I'm going to ask is, Dr. Banks and Mr. Knapper, if you might, the two of you together, in your book you sort of alternate chapters,
Yeah.
right? So maybe if you two together could talk about your story and talk about why you wrote the book you did.
Yeah. Shall I jump in first? Yeah. So let me give you a bit of an overview of the story. Because one of the things that comes up often is, why did you write this book? How'd you get from 1979, when my father was murdered, with allegedly Isaac Knapper being arrested and convicted, to, this point in time where we're sitting on stage. And the truth of the matter is, I wish I could say that this was, a clear-cut desire to try to, take on the legal system, prison reform, and all of that. But the truth of the matter is, it was, for me, reaching out to Isaac was about survival. I was sinking. So the story is this: 1979, my father, who was a professor at the University of Maine, Orono, came down to New Orleans for a history convention. He stayed at the Hyatt Regency Hotel, had dinner at the French Quarter, and with a colleague. And on his way back was held up right outside, for those of you who are familiar with the area, right outside the Hyatt Regency and the Poitiers Plaza, shot dead, point blank. My family's from Maine. We had, and for anybody who doesn't know Maine, it's about as far away from New Orleans as you can get. I mean, one of the things that feels particularly poignant for this story is that it was at the time, and remains, about 95% white. And part of the story, as it has become known to us, is that we were told, once Isaac was arrested, we really were it was like hook, line, and sinker. We were told that they absolutely have the right guy. He's a bad egg. Mind you, this is a 16-year-old boy, right? So we were fed all these lies. Isaac was arrested, taken to in a one-day trial. Was convicted of first-degree murder, even though he was a juvenile. Just missed the death penalty. Went to Angola for. And I'm going to let you talk about that. What I want to say is he was luckily exonerated in 1992. My family didn't know about it. Nobody from Louisiana justice system let our family know, so we had no idea that it was an open murder case until my brother-in-law Googled his name in 2004. And at that time, all of this information came up about the DA system under Harry Connick. I mean, all of the people that are so familiar right now, but that clearly prosecution had withheld Brady material that would have been exculpatory. Including, and I always have to say this because I think people think these are subtle kind of little things, but the Brady material that was withheld was that there was a holdup 1 week after my father's murder, 1 block from where he was murdered, by men that fit the description of the people that held up and murdered my father, including one that had a sailor hat, and they had the gun that murdered my father, when 1 bullet that ballistic test showed was the bullet that killed my father. That is what was left out of the defense, okay? Anyway, to wrap up my part, so we found out, we tried to actually have the case opened, but one of the things that feels really important, right, we were devastated. When my family found out that a young black man had been railroaded into this conviction. I always say the only thing worse than having a parent murdered is having a parent murdered and then finding out that actually someone else got drawn into your whole family tragedy, right? It has been devastating. We couldn't get the case reopened. And finally, in 2015, as a psychiatrist, I was just tormented by, all of these unfinished business. I didn't know who did it, why they did it. Isaac was out in the world, and I reached out to the lawyer who is now Judge Lori White. I reached out to her. Didn't expect to hear back from her, but actually heard back within 24 hours. And she and I had a correspondence that lasted about a week, at which point I said, hey, do you think Isaac would meet me? And My sister and I have my sister here, Nancy, who, hi, Nance. And she and I flew to New Orleans in 2015, December of 2015, and had probably the most transformative weekend of my life. And I won't go into all of this now. Maybe we can get into it during the conversation, but I want to get other voices in here. So why don't you jump in here?
Yes, I'm Isaac Knapper, and I think, could you hear me now? Yes, sorry. Yeah, I'm Isaac Knapper, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be here and to express our story and what happened. I was convicted, like Dr. Amy said, for a crime I had no knowledge of. And some things may be asked that I can't answer because in the interrogation room, I couldn't answer. They was asking me all kind of things, and I didn't know what to say because I was innocent. I wasn't there. I didn't know anything about it. All I knew was they came to get me, and they arrested me and accused me of murder that I had no knowledge of. And 16 years old, I was training, a boxer, training for the Junior Olympics at the time, and I was already a two-time Golden Glove champion, and my focus was on boxing rather than education. I was focusing on boxing. That was my dream, to become the boxing champion of the world, something that would also may bring my mother and I, my brothers and sisters, out of poverty, and so that was my focus. And when they came to the house to arrest me, we was living in the Melpomene housing projects, and I remember my mother. I was half in a sleep, but I can hear from the room. I can hear when the police come to the house and they ask my mom, they say, "We come to get Isaac Knapper. Where is he?" My mom said, "Well, for what? What you want with my son?" And they said, he killed someone. And my mom said, "Killed someone? No, y'all got to have the wrong person." They said, "No, we come in. Where is it?" So they bogarted their way in like they normally do, and came to the room. I opened my eyes up to guns that was pointing in my face, and I had on nothing but my underwear, and they pulled me up out of the bed, snatched me up, cuffed me, put handcuffs on me, and my mother said, hold up, what are y'all doing?" They said, "We taking him down." My mom said, "Well, tell me something. I need to know what's going on. This is my son. He's 16 years old. He's a juvenile." And the cops was like, they wasn't professional at all at this time anyway, and they was just talking crazy, and they said, "Well, we bringing him down. He has to see a judge. If he's innocent, he has to talk to a judge." Well, my mom said, "At least let him put on some pants or something." They said, "No, we bringing him just like this. If you want him to bring his clothes to central lockup." So they put me in the back of the car and took me to central lockup, and in my underwear. And I was in a holding cell with other guys that was much older than me, and they was like, "Man, what are you doing in here, kid?" They was calling me a kid and said, "You don't belong in here with us. Oh, you killed somebody?" I said, "No, I didn't." I said, "But that's what they saying." They said, "That's why they have you in here with us, because you don't belong in here. You're too young. How old are you?" Now, it was a story like that. Now, I'm 16 years old, and they was like, kind of like, "Wow, you need to make a phone call and try to find out what's going on." And in a holding cell, they has a phone. That you remember the pay phones, you put a dime in there? Yeah, because this was in 1979. So one of the guys, he give me a dime. He said, "Here, man, you need to make a phone call." And I was happy to get that, and I put the dime in. I dialed my mom to let her know where I was at and what was going on and everything. And so, and try and speed this up. After about maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, they come to get me to take the mug shot. When you have these numbers across your chest and you have to pose for the camera and you got to turn sideways and everything. So they was booking me, and after the booking situation, after everything, the preliminaries and everything went on, after maybe about a few hours passed, and they finally brought me to a cell, changed me out, put me on an orange jumpsuit, and the interrogation started that same day. And when the interrogation started, that's when everything started really getting kind of bad for me, because they were slapping me around, and every day, single day, until leading up to the trial. They would come get me. They put me in the hospital. They broke my ribs. I had to get operated on my chest. They had to cut me on both sides to take blood clots and swollen glands out my body, and they had to put tubes in my ribs, and they stomped me, they drugged me, they cuffed my leg, my ankles up, put the cuffs behind my back. They drugged me from the forward floor all the way down to the first floor with my head hitting every step, And my mom tried to come visit me. They refused to let my mother see me because they didn't want her to see that they had did me what they did. And so my mom, she wouldn't take no for an answer. My mother, she went to the chief, and she said, I need to see my son. They won't let me visit my son. Something is wrong. I need to see my son. He's a juvenile. He don't belongs here for once. He didn't do anything, and so on and so on. So the Chief Rudy, some of you may know of him. Well, anyway, Chief Rudy, he came, brought my mom back to the county jail where I was, and he went in there with my mom, and he asked the deputies, where is Isaac Knapper? They had placed me in an area what was no longer being used. The area was like a storage room that they used to be isolation, solitary confinement area, but it had been closed down for about close to 10 years. And spider webs, roaches and rats, everything up there, the place hadn't been open. Nobody hadn't even been up there in about 10 years. They put me up there. They had to pry the cell open. They pried the cell open with a crowbar after they turned the key, because that's how rusty it was. They put me in the cell, no mattress, and left the cuffs on me. They left me in there for 24 hours, locked the door. But when they got me, I was still sore. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe hard. I had to breathe real slow because my ribs was broke. And so when Chief Rudy, he came up there personally and got me out of there, and they brought me, he put me in his car. They rushed me to Charity Hospital. And when I got there, they had to start surgery right away, and then they had to cut on me. They had to and did all the x-rays and everything. And I stayed in the hospital about 8 or 9 weeks. I stayed in Charity Hospital.
I'm sorry. So I want to just set the scene too, because you're 16 at this time,
Right.
Right. And I know, this is a story that is just incredibly dramatic and really frightening. And I think
Yes.
when you, how long were you there before you were convicted?
I was there.
And this was an OPP.
Yes.
Okay, an OPP, for those of you who don't know, has this incredible history of being a violent place. And here's a 16-year-old with all the adults.
Right.
Yes.
And so you were there in OPP for
about 7 months, six or 7 months.
Before the trial.
before
Before
the
the
trial.
trial. Yes.
And then they took you to Angola.
No, after the trial, I was there for about maybe 6 or 7 months before the trial, and after the trial, I was there for maybe about 3 or 4 more months. And then
you got sent out.
it brought me to Angola.
What I want to do is unpack some more of the story in just a second, but what I'd like to do now, if we can, is sort of ask the same question of Sister Prejean. If you could talk to about how your story and how it led to your
We'll
writing
get back
your
to you
books.
as soon
And
as
then
we
we're
can.
going to
I'm
weave
gonna
it
be
all
short.
together, because
Yep.
the themes
Would
are
you-
the same.
Would you hand me
Yes.
Yeah. This is so, I had no idea when I got involved with the first man I wrote on death row and then witnessed his execution. I had no idea. I thought it would be a fluke if there was an innocent person that ever went to death row or to prison. What did I know? A white woman of privilege. You're basically good nun. I didn't slap kids around with a ruler or stuff like that. I was a teacher, worked in a parish, taught people Bible, and it was the writing of a letter to a man on death row in 1982. And this was after I had awakened that the gospel of Jesus was about more than just being charitable to people around you. But it was about engaging in justice that led me to awaken and move to the St. Thomas Housing Project. And when I moved there, Isaac, my African-American brothers and sisters became my teachers, and I learned about the other America. I learned how it was with the police. I learned what it was when you went to get housing. Learned what it was when you tried to get a loan in a bank. All the rules were different. It was like being in another country. And in their patience with me, they taught me, and I learned, first time I ever heard white privilege. I didn't know I had any kind of privilege. What do you mean white privilege? And they going, sister, when you go shopping, you ever have a house detective follow you in the store? You ever been told, oh, you're a real credit to your race? I mean, linguistically, look in the dictionary, white, pure snow, black ball, blacklist, black bad, white good, even linguistically in the language. And then there was that invitation to write that letter in 82. Naively, I thought, well, you know, as an English major, I could write some letters, you know. Poor guy on death row, I'd write him a few letters. I had no idea he was going to be executed. I mean, I want to say a little bit about Jesus. You got to watch this Jesus thing, because Jesus is sneaky. Because what happened is, I said, yeah, sure, we'll write some letters. So then we writing back and forth, and I said, I'll come visit you. And then he sent me the forms. He said, would you be my spiritual advisor? You know, I'm a Catholic. You know, you're a nun. I say, yeah, I'll sign it. And when he's executed 2 years later, the only one that could be with him in the death house for those 3 days before he was taken and killed and walk with him to execution was the spiritual advisor, who was me. Mm-hmm. The way it unfolds for us is we put our little boat in a current and we begin to get involved, and it brings us to where we need to be. When I came out of that execution chamber that night, Patrick Saunier, I think 90% of people in 1984 were for the death penalty. I mean, when Dead Man Walking came out in 93, 80% nationally were for the death penalty. So what do? You've been brought into this and you witness something. I watched this human being who was alive. He and his brother were guilty of a terrible crime. They had killed in cold blood 2 teenage kids, pointed a .22 rifle to their head, shot them dead, left their bodies in a sugarcane field. Terrible crime, which you feel the moral outrage of it. So I had that inside me, of the suffering of that family losing their kids. And then I'm watching in this protocol of death where they're going to take this human being and they're going to strap him down and they're going to kill him. They're going to pump 1,900 volts of electricity through his body, and I'm there. And when you witness something, when you were one of the citizens or one of the people that come awake to something before other people, most people said, well, justice was done. There's a saying from Latin America, what the eye doesn't see, the heart can't feel. I was a witness. Came out of that execution chamber that night, vomited right there in the parking lot. But then it was born in me. People think this is a good thing. I didn't know anything about the death penalty, how it worked, or what it means to take a human being. And kind of in this very deliberate, they're rendered defenseless. It was the heart of my dialogue with Pope John Paul. Where is the dignity in taking a human being who's alive and rendering them completely defenseless and deliberately killing them? Can you help our church? We hear a lot of people say they're pro-life. What they mean by pro-life is innocent life. What about the dignity even of somebody who's guilty and rendering them defenseless? We have a way to protect ourselves as a society from people who are violent. That's why we have prisons. Can you help our church? And he did. We've grown. 1,500 blooming years of dialogue. Took a while. But finally, for the Catholic Church to align with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is Article 3, simply by being a human person, we have an inalienable right to life. Inalienable means it can't be pried from us, which means governments don't give human rights for good behavior and they can't take them away for bad behavior. That's the change in the Catholic Catechism just happened 2018. Just say a little bit more and then we'll turn it back, because this man, I mean, this is the big story of real life people. And look, here he is before us today. I just want to say, I didn't know I was going to write a book. I mean, I'm Louisiana. We talk to each other. I thought of a book as a kind of a passive thing, you know, kind of just sits on the shelf and you hope people read it, you know, little words on a page. And but gradually I came to see, well, people were saying, you ought to write a book, you ought to write, okay. I had a wonderful editor. if I hadn't had Jason Epstein at Random House, you never would have heard of Dead Man Walking. And he taught me how to construct the journey of bringing your audience with you, because the first place you got to bring them is you got to stand in the outrage of the crime. We're not talking about innocent people. This is a terrible crime, and we feel the outrage. And now what? And then he showed me you got to walk this wire step by step, and then bring people into that execution chamber to bring it to their own conscience. And I didn't know the power of a book. I didn't know that when people read books and you're quiet and you're using your imagination, you can go to places that change your life forever about what you think about things. So this book got out, 93. It was such a miracle. First of all, because it was written well, it got really good reviews. And then in 94, when the paperback came out, Susan Sarandon read it while she was doing a client in Memphis. Look, I'm going to tell y'all about a miracle here. She stayed up all night. Our friend Arlene Donovan had given her the book and said, don't read it at night, you're going to stay up all night. She stayed up all night. She had to come for the filming in New Orleans. She called me up on the phone. I didn't know movie stars from Adam's Cat. We had to look up, me and the other nuns, we ran a film so I can see what Susan Sarandon looks like when we go to the Bon Ton to go get some crawfish etouffee, right? And so I had her mixed up with Gina Davis the whole movie. I mean, I'm going, and the nuns are saying, she's going to be real. You know, Gina Davis had ditched one in that movie. So when Susan comes to the restaurant, I go, thank you, Jesus. She's Louise. It took me a long time to tell that story. She pestered Tim Robbins, her partner, for 9 months to get him to read the book. He probably did it for domestic tranquility. Did you read the nun's book? He said it was the easiest screenplay he ever wrote because I brought you over to both sides. And that's what you got to do when you tell a good story. So anyway, in this edition of the book, there's an afterword by Susan and Tim in there. They can give you more details on the writing of the film and all. So I'm going to stop there, but it's great to be with you.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I'm struck by, and Sister Prejean, you really have this dichotomy. You write about people who are guilty, factually guilty, and you write about people who are factually innocent.
Yeah, that's...
And I think, but ultimately, what your story in your book and what your book, Mr. Knapper, and Dr. Banks is all about is the state, the people who are acting on behalf of all of us committed a terrible, horrible wrong to each of you in a very different way.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the questions I have is, okay, so what do we do now that we have, I mean, you've been uniquely harmed. You lost.
First thing we got to do is we got to get death off the table and not let government be in charge of killing people. Got to do that.
Right.
And there's an LA repeal bill right now going on. LA repeal. If you've never been active before, just go to larepeal.org and get involved. That's one thing. I'm sure you got other suggestions.
Yes.
I mean, again, you are facing the death penalty, right? I mean, and to think if two people had voted differently, you would have been on death row.
Right.
And I want to pause for a moment. He was 16.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, we didn't abolish death penalty for juveniles, for children, until 2005 in this country. Okay, that's where we're at, not till 2005. So you were looking down a barrel of a gun.
Yes, yes. You know, and like you said, at 16 years old, I mean, when the jury, it was a 12-man jury, and I was found guilty for first degree. We know first degree carries the death sentence. Second degree is natural life without parole, or probation or suspension of sentence. So I was actually found guilty for first degree murder, which is the death sentence. 10 of the 12, out of the 12, voted for the death sentence. And it was 2 ladies that stood up and said, hold up, y'all got that wrong. I didn't vote for the death penalty because it's possible that this guy may be innocent. You know, and she actually said, and another lady stood up right behind her and said the same thing. I did not vote for the death sentence. And that's what saved me. And I'm able to be here and talk about it right now because I would have been dead In fact, the judge, Judge Shea, when I walked into his section, maybe about 11 and a half years later, when my conviction, I got granted an evidentiary hearing. And when I walked in, he said, "Get him out my courtroom. I don't understand why he not dead." That was the attitude that the judge had toward me. He said, he looked at the paperwork, and I'm sitting there in the courtroom, then came back on court order from Angola. And I'm sitting there, and he looked at the paperwork, and then he looked up. He looked at me. He said, "What he doing in my courtroom?" He said, he's supposed to have been dead. Why they didn't kill him? Get him out my courtroom and send him back to prison for the rest of his life. That was the way he denied my writ. And I had to go back to Angola. And so we had to take it out of his hand. We had to go in a higher court because it was obvious that he wasn't seeing it that way. He wanted me to die. Yeah, and so we went to a higher court. We went to the Supreme Court. And they came back maybe about close to a year later, and they reversed my conviction on the Brady material that would have changed things in trial if they would have presented it to my defense attorney and they withheld that exculpatory materials. So, and I'm happy that I'm here to talk about it. And under the circumstances, we know that it was bad. It was a terrible crime that happened, and I embrace Amy and Nancy, and I can feel the pain that they experienced. And I'm more than sure that they can feel the pain that I experienced. And that's why we have such connection that we have now. We good friends. She stays at my house when she come down here. I stays at her house when I go to Maine, Boston. So that's unusual. And that's what we need to see. People need to know about these kind of things.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think there is a really important role of stories, right? I mean, I think being able to, share our story with all of you, and even find where are you, locate yourself in that story when you're reading stories like this, because I think it's way too easy, and I'm saying this as a white person, it's way too easy to not put yourself in there and really, realize what is actually going on, sort of as I entered this world, I now know the layers of things that could have been different, like around prison reform and around even prosecution, right? One of the things that happened in Isaac's case is that they didn't have evidence, quite frankly. The one person that could have testified against him had some emotional issues. They didn't even call him to the witness stand, but yet this was the guy that actually originally picked him out. The guy that was with my father, John Hackala, he had been pushed through a door and lost his glasses, so he couldn't identify Isaac, and what they did eventually is they had picked up two guys and they played them off each other, right? So they went to Isaac and said, "Hey, we know this other guy, we know you both were there, this other guy shot him, we know that if you turn state's evidence against him, you'll get a lesser sentence." And they did the same thing to Isaac, right? So sure enough, Leroy William takes this, right? But so, you can start with cameras and around interrogation, right? They're just, if you really look at what is being done, what is being proposed, right, just around the legal system in terms of cleaning up the act of prosecutors, DAs, that sort of thing, I think that's one area. I think the other area that we're particularly interested in, okay, if the justice system is failing so wholeheartedly, right, and some studies are saying 6 to 10%, I know, Isaac, you think even higher, 6 to 10% of people that are in prison are wrongly convicted, right? So we've got, and by and large, overrepresented people of color, right? I mean, it's part of the whole racist legal system that is involved. And so, those of us who are have been in it and have felt really pummeled by the legal system are sort of interested in things like reconciliation, right? We're organizing with some other folks in Louisiana a larger reconciliation conference for June, actually, of this year, and really get people talking about how can we do accountability differently, right? Because I can tell you there was nothing that happened for my family that felt just, right? There was nothing that was just. It was all unjust, and we didn't even know how bad until we found out what happened to you, you know? It's not working.
And of course, the wrongful conviction isn't just, I mean, you obviously lived it, but it has tentacles that reach out to the families around it and the community at large. I really would like, at this time, I just can't believe how little time we have, because quite frankly, I could spend hours here. And there's so much to unpack. But I do want to open, we have just a few minutes left, and I want to open it to questions. So I'm going to ask folks, if you have a question, we either need to have you come up to the mic here,
Mic
or I
up here.
believe that there may be a floating mic. Faith has our floating mic that will come to you.
Thank you all for your presentations. I have two questions for Isaac, and if you would choose which one you prefer to answer in this space. I'd like to know, I mean, obviously it's your own spirit in the training and love that you got from your mother and your family, but how did you find the enormous kindness of heart and forgiveness over bitterness to endure the years that you did from when you were arrested and brutally treated and living in Angola? And the second one is, what sort of restitution, remediation, apology for the moral injury that was executed on you by the specific professionals, legal professionals involved, the lawyers and judges, or the state of Louisiana, to provide you some sort of restorative justice for you?
For your first question, you know, my mother, she's very spiritual. She's a Christian lady, and she kind of installed that in me to be spiritual and to have faith, you know, in the Creator, that things would happen. So with me practicing her faith and coming to the understanding that in order for us to be, even when you say the prayer, to be forgiven, we have to learn to forgive. All right, our prayers won't be answered if we don't forgive. So, I wouldn't feel right praying if I don't ask for forgiveness. So I have to forgive, you know, and I forgive. I forgave everybody. I didn't want to have nothing in my heart, you know, to hinder me from making it to the kingdom of God. So I forgave, and I humbled myself. I've always been a very humble person. So that wasn't hard to do, to train myself to be humble. Now, second, yes, we filed for wrongly conviction, which was Judge Lori White. She was the attorney at the time. And we lost the case because the state of Louisiana, Detective John Dillman, District Attorney Harry Connick, they was all immune to malicious prosecution. They couldn't be sued. And all they can do is just give me my freedom and say, go on. And in fact, while we was in court, before they made the ruling that they could not be sued, Lori asked one of the detectives, who was the detective on the case, said, well, at least you could apologize to him. And he looked at me, he said, well, he got his freedom. What else he want?
There you go.
I never got an apology, you know, so they still, I think it has something to do with when prosecutors get a conviction, they don't own up to their own mistake. Right. And they refuse to come back and say, I made a mistake.
Right.
It's just something about it. They won't accept that. They refuse to acknowledge that they made a mistake. They don't want to come back to you and apologize to you, you know, because they figure, well, you won your case on a technicality, you know, get out of here. And that's the attitude that we have to deal with.
Well, I'm deeply sorry, and thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Okay, so I know that this is supposed to be a prison reform, but question for you is, based on what you just said, that they were immune, are there any ways that we can get some policy in place so that when there's evidence of deliberate, you know, misconduct happening, that they are forced to pay some sort of restitution? There are some sort of consequences.
Well,
Maybe that could help.
There currently is a statute and that the amount has actually recently been raised. But the burden is on the person who is exonerated to prove and I'm going to apologize because I haven't read it recently. I don't know if it's preponderance of the evidence or clear and convincing to show that they're factually innocent. And so it is a significant legal burden. One of the things to think about is it's kind of hard to prove a negative, right?
That's right.
So how is Mr. Knapper going to prove? I mean, it becomes difficult to prove that he wasn't there, right? I mean, obviously there's evidence, and it's a challenge. But what we have to do is we have to change how the government views about this, right?
Right.
But I want to, please.
Well, what I wanted to say is, I mean, I think, right, these are individuals that are doing these actions, but they're also systems. And I think this stuff is so baked into the system at this point that it's almost impossible for them to back up. Dave Pattison, who was one of the lawyers who was involved in this case, Nancy and I, when we came down to meet Isaac, actually met with him, and we decided beforehand that we weren't going to tell him that we believed in Isaac's innocence. We just wanted to hear what he had to say. And he, right off the bat, started in with all of the reasons that he was sure that he had the right case, right? And that and that this was accurate. And in fact, just about a month ago, he had heard about the book, I don't know how. Yes, I do, actually, a media person had reached out to him, and he sent, and this is what we're up against, right, is he sent me a package of information, including a lot of bad press about Isaac, right, as if we didn't know that. And then in bold capital, a paragraph that basically said, no one ever asked anybody to withhold exculpatory information. He wanted that to be right front and center, right? And, I've kidded with Isaac. I'd said, let's pull him into a reconciliation meeting, right? Let's sit down and talk about this. Because, I can tell you, when we directly confronted him with, but the gun was over there. He, everything. He had a little kind of facile explanation, right? And so we're talking about systems of oppression here. They're just so baked into our legal system that it's, yes, of course, Isaac should be compensated. Anybody that is wrongly convicted should be compensated for what he lost, I'm walking across the campus last night with him, having gotten a chance to go to medical school, and he's like, I would have loved to go to college. And that is like a dagger. These are people's lives. And, it's not okay. And it's not, and the other thing I want to say, this is part of my thing that I have, is there's a lot of white people in this audience. It's not okay for any white people either, right? This is not okay. And we have to get in the fight to change these systems of oppression, because by and large, white people created them, right? And I just want to make that crystal clear. So I'm hoping, to spur people on.
I'm getting a cue from Faith.
I think we have one more question.
Okay, one more question.
It's probably a silly question considering what we're talking about, but did they ever identify and figure out who did kill your father? No.
No,
I'm very sorry.
unsolved. And you know what? We get this question a lot. And the truth of the matter is, at this point, it's 40 some odd years later, and I don't care. That catching a killer is not necessarily about justice, right? I get it. There needs to be accountability, but if the way that you're seeking that is to go out and, get any random person, which is what has been done, it's not okay. So it's sort of now, after all these years, beside the point. And it's not going to bring my father back.
By convicting him wrongfully, it's denying you guys.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah.
When you care about justice, see,
Right.
then you would care about that. But in the mission of the prosecution office is supposed to be to seek justice.
Yes.
And it's such a frail system, much less to leave the discretion up to prosecutors to seek death or not. It's all up to, that's the way the Supreme Court set it up in Gregg. An impossible criteria of only the worst of the worst. Separate out all your ordinary murders, only the worst of the worst. Nobody knows what that is. And it's up to the discretion of prosecutors to seek death or not. So look at what we just experienced after 17 years in the federal death sentence on death row, not to have any executions. And before he left office, Trump killed 13 people. Why?
Yeah.
Because he could.
Because he could.
So to leave that discretion up to these individuals like this. So we got a lot to do, but then we got people like Isaac who are here before us. And it gives us courage and energy to start working for justice in a way that we can participate. We have the example of this man, and Amy too, you know, with losing your father. Yeah.
I want to thank the audience and thank you for the great honor of being on this stage with you. I want to make two plugs. One, the legislature has one bill in the House and one bill in the Senate to abolish the death penalty in Louisiana. Please make your voices heard. Call your legislator, call your representative. We need to get that passed.
LArepeal.org. Go to it and it'll lead you.
Okay.
The other plug I'm making is that these wonderful authors their books are for sale in the bookstore, and they're going to be available to sign and autograph. And your support, both obviously by buying their books, but also being there, being present for them, is an endorsement of their message and their mission. So thank you so much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice job, Isaac.